At exactly 3:33 in the morning, most of the world is asleep. Highways are empty, cities hum at their lowest frequency. Human activity drops to a quiet background noise, and something unusual happens to the planet. Electrical demand stabilizes, atmospheric interference decreases. Even seismic data becomes cleaner. For scientists, this hour is known for clarity. For astronomers, it is a gift. For historians, it is when decisive moments quietly pass unnoticed. And for physicists, it is one of the rare times when the universe seems to speak more clearly than usual. Across centuries and cultures, the same time appears again and again in journals, lab notes, and personal logs, not as a mystical coincidence, but as a statistical anomaly. A clustering of breakthroughs, realizations, and irreversible decisions that occur when human distraction is at its minimum. At 3:33 a.m., a surprising number of Nobel laureates were awake. At 3:33 a.m., equations were completed that later reshaped our understanding of reality. At 3:33 a.m., experiments failed in ways that forced science forward instead of backward. This is not about destiny in the supernatural sense. This is about thresholds. In physics, a system under stress does not change gradually. It resists, accumulates tension, and then suddenly transitions. Water becomes steam. A star collapses into a supernova. A quiet universe crosses a line it cannot uncross. The test in these systems is never visible until it is complete. Human beings are systems, too. Consciousness is not a constant stream. It is a series of states. Attention rises and falls. Belief hardens or dissolves. At certain moments, the mind exits one phase and enters another. Neuroscience calls these transitions. Philosophy calls them awakenings. Physics simply calls them irreversible processes. The title of this film sounds dramatic, even provocative. But beneath it is a sober scientific question that researchers are only beginning to approach seriously. What happens when observation reaches a tipping point? What happens when probability collapses into outcome? What happens when a system, after prolonged uncertainty, finally resolves? This is not a story about being chosen by heaven in the religious sense. It is a story about selection in the language of the universe. Selection through constraints, through time, through pressure, through tests that do not announce themselves while they are happening, only afterward. If there is a final signal, it is not a voice, it is not a sign in the sky. It is a change in conditions so fundamental that the previous state can never be recovered. The test does not end with celebration. It ends with silence, and then with consequence. Tonight, we are going to slow this idea down. We are going to strip it of exaggeration and rebuild it using physics, history, neuroscience, and cosmology. We are going to look at why moments like 3:33 a.m. matter, not symbolically, but structurally. Why thresholds feel personal, why resolution feels earned, and why, when the test is complete, there is no applause, only motion. This is not a motivational story. It is not a promise. It is an explanation. And once you see how it works, you may realize that some tests only reveal themselves after they are already over. If you enjoy long-form science documentaries that slow things down and go deep, subscribe to The Boring Universe. Like this video if you value careful thinking over noise. Leave a comment to support the channel and answer this question. Which part of the country are you watching from? In science, the word test does not mean what it means in everyday language. A test is not something designed to judge effort or intention. A test is a constraint placed on a system to determine what remains when options are removed. In physics, we test materials by applying stress. In biology, environments test organisms by limiting resources. In mathematics, a proof tests whether a statement can survive logic without contradiction. Passing a test does not mean success in the emotional sense. It means stability under pressure. When people talk about life feeling like a test, they are often describing a prolonged period of uncertainty under constraint. Limited information, delayed outcomes, repeated feedback that seems inconclusive. From a scientific perspective, this is not poetic language. It is an accurate description of how complex systems behave near a transition point. To understand why a test can feel invisible while it is happening, we need to start with phase transitions. In thermodynamics, a phase transition is a change in the state of matter that occurs when certain variables cross a critical threshold. Temperature, pressure, or energy input gradually increase, but nothing appears to change. Ice remains ice. Then, at a precise point, the structure rearranges itself. The system is no longer what it was. Importantly, the transition itself is fast, almost instantaneous. All the time was spent accumulating the conditions required for change. This pattern appears everywhere in nature. Stars spend millions of years quietly burning hydrogen, appearing stable and unchanging. Then, when fuel runs low, gravity wins, collapse follows. A supernova occurs in seconds. The test was not the explosion. The test was the long period of balance before it failed. Human cognition follows a similar pattern. The brain is an energy-intensive organ that evolved to predict outcomes under uncertainty. It updates beliefs gradually, integrating new data into existing models. Most of the time, these updates are small, but occasionally the accumulated evidence becomes too large to ignore. A belief collapses, a worldview shifts. Psychologists call this cognitive restructuring. Philosophers call it a paradigm shift. From the inside, it feels sudden. From the outside, it looks inevitable. This is why the idea of a final signal resonates so strongly. In complex systems, signals do not announce transitions ahead of time. They appear at the moment of collapse. In physics, this is known as critical slowing down. As a system approaches a tipping point, its ability to recover from disturbances decreases. Fluctuations grow larger. Variability increases. To an observer, things feel unstable, uncertain, charged. At the human level, this manifests as heightened awareness, anxiety, restlessness, or clarity, depending on context. The system senses that it is near a boundary, even if it cannot articulate what that boundary is. The test feels hardest right before it ends, not because it intensifies, but because the system is losing its ability to remain unchanged. Why 3:33 a.m. appears so often in personal narratives has less to do with mysticism and more to do with physiology and environment. Human circadian rhythms dip sharply between 200 and 400 a.m. Body temperature is low. External noise is reduced. Cognitive filtering weakens. The brain becomes more sensitive to internal signals. This is why insomnia feels existential, why insights emerge uninvited, why errors and breakthroughs both cluster in the early morning hours. Historically, many scientific discoveries occurred during these quiet periods not because the universe favors them, but because human interference is minimal. Fewer distractions, fewer social constraints. The mind interacts more directly with the problem at hand. When a system is isolated, its dynamics become easier to observe. In quantum physics, observation plays a peculiar role. The observer effect is often misunderstood, but at its core is a simple idea. Measuring a system changes it, not because consciousness is magical, but because interaction requires energy exchange. At microscopic scales, that exchange is significant. The act of measurement forces a system to choose a state. This is known as wave function collapse. Before measurement, a quantum system exists in a superposition of possible states. After measurement, only one outcome remains. The test is not whether the system was worthy of a particular result. The test is whether the conditions for resolution were met. When people describe feeling chosen, what they are often experiencing is resolution after prolonged superposition. Multiple possible futures existed. Uncertainty persisted. Then, conditions change. A decision was made. An outcome occurred. From the inside, it feels personal. From the outside, it is structural. Importantly, physics makes no moral judgments. There is no reward encoded in the laws of nature. There is only stability and instability. Systems that adapt survive. Systems that cannot transition fail. Selection is not praise. It is consequence. The language of crowns and ascension is metaphorical, but it points to a real phenomenon. After a transition, a system often gains new degrees of freedom. Steam can do work that ice cannot. A post-supernova universe contains heavier elements that make planets and life possible. After cognitive restructuring, a person perceives options that were previously invisible. The crown is not a gift. It is a load-bearing structure. With new capacity comes new responsibility. In physics, higher energy states are less stable. They require constant input to maintain. Stars that grow too massive collapse under their own gravity. Complexity always comes with fragility. This is why the end of a test often feels anticlimactic. There is no celebration built into natural transitions. The system simply moves on. The universe does not pause to acknowledge the difficulty of the process. It only responds to what now exists. The idea of heaven preparing something is, in scientific terms, the environment reorganizing around a new state. After a phase transition, the surrounding conditions must adjust. Pressure equalizes. Energy redistributes. In social systems, this looks like changed relationships. In cognitive systems, it looks like altered priorities. In physical systems, it is simply equilibrium reestablished at a new level. What makes this feel profound is that the process is asymmetric. You cannot go back. Ice can melt, but it does not spontaneously refreeze without energy removal. A collapsed belief rarely returns unchanged. Once a star explodes, it cannot become the same star again. The test being complete means the previous state is no longer accessible. From a historical perspective, eras behave like systems under test. The Renaissance did not announce itself while it was happening. People did not wake up knowing they had passed from medieval to modern. The transition was recognized only later, when the consequences became undeniable. The same is true for scientific revolutions. Copernicus did not feel triumphant, he felt cautious, uncertain. The test was not whether his idea was correct, it was whether it could survive scrutiny. In this sense, urgency is not drama, it is physics. When systems approach critical thresholds, time matters. Small inputs can have outsized effects. A minor perturbation can determine which outcome becomes real. This is why moments near transition points feel charged. The future is sensitive to the present in a way it usually is not. The quiet of early morning amplifies this sensitivity. Reduced sensory input allows internal fluctuations to dominate. Thoughts loop, patterns emerge. For some, this feels like revelation. For others, it feels like dread. Both are responses to the same underlying condition: proximity to change. The test, then, is endurance under uncertainty, not passive waiting but continued functioning without resolution. In physics, metastable states can persist for long periods before collapsing. A supercooled liquid remains liquid below its freezing point until a disturbance triggers crystallization. The waiting is not a sign of failure, it is a property of the system. When the collapse finally occurs, it is fast, it feels decisive, it feels final. And afterward, the system reorganizes. That reorganization is what people interpret as meaning, as reward, as destiny, but at its core it is adaptation. This documentary is not claiming that the universe selects individuals for special favor. It is showing that systems under constraint eventually resolve. If you are part of that system, the resolution feels personal. If you observe it from outside, it looks inevitable. Once a system crosses a threshold, the most dangerous assumption is that the difficult part is over. In physics, the moment after a transition is often the most unstable phase of all. The system has changed state, but the surrounding conditions have not yet fully adapted. Energy redistributes unevenly. New feedback loops emerge. Old safeguards disappear. What follows is not rest, but recalibration. This is where most misunderstandings about completion begin. When people say the test is complete, they imagine an ending, a finish line, a reward state where effort finally stops mattering. But in science, completion simply means irreversibility. It means the previous configuration cannot be restored without external force. It does not mean safety. It does not mean certainty. It means commitment to a new trajectory. To understand why this matters, we need to examine how systems behave immediately after selection has occurred. In evolutionary biology, selection does not favor comfort. It favors fitness within a specific environment. When a population passes through a bottleneck event, such as a drastic climate shift or mass extinction, the survivors are not better in a universal sense. They are simply compatible with what remains. Their traits are amplified not because they are optimal, but because alternatives have been eliminated. The same logic applies to cognitive and social systems. After prolonged uncertainty, once a decision or outcome collapses into reality, the mind often interprets survival as validation. But survival is not endorsement, it is alignment with constraints. This distinction matters because it explains why post-transition periods feel strangely empty, even after intense struggle. The nervous system has adapted to sustained uncertainty. Stress hormones have been elevated for weeks, months, sometimes years. When the pressure suddenly releases, the body does not immediately feel relief. It feels absence. Neuroscientists call this the contrast effect. The baseline has shifted, but the brain has not recalibrated its expectations. In extreme cases, this produces what psychologists refer to as post-achievement depression. Athletes experience it after major victories. Researchers experience it after publishing long-awaited results. Astronauts have described it after returning from space. The goal is reached. The test is complete, and yet something feels wrong. From a systems perspective, this reaction is expected. During the test phase, uncertainty provides direction. Every action is framed against an unresolved outcome. Once resolution occurs, that organizing principle disappears. The system must quickly establish a new source of structure or risk disintegration. In physics, this moment is known as symmetry breaking aftermath. When a system transitions, it often chooses one of many possible equivalent states. Once chosen symmetry is broken, but the surrounding environment still reflects the old symmetry. Tension arises between what has changed and what has not. This is why phase transitions are accompanied by turbulence. When air becomes unstable, storms form. When fluids transition between flow regimes, vortices appear. When societies undergo rapid change, unrest follows. The test ends, but the consequences begin. The idea of a final signal fits neatly into this framework. Signals in science are not messages. They are detectable changes that indicate a process has crossed a threshold. A spike in radiation signals a nuclear reaction. A sudden shift in frequency signals a phase change in materials. The signal does not cause the event. It reveals that the event has already occurred. This distinction is critical. People often wait for signals as permission to change. In reality, signals are confirmations, not invitations. By the time they appear, the underlying process is already complete. In cosmology, the cosmic microwave background is often described as the universe's oldest signal. It is not the Big Bang itself. It is the afterglow, evidence that the universe cooled enough for light to travel freely. The transition had already happened. The signal simply remained. At the human level, moments of clarity often arrive after decisions have been made unconsciously. Neuroscience experiments have shown that the brain initiates actions milliseconds before conscious awareness registers intent. Consciousness receives the signal after the system has already committed. This raises an uncomfortable implication. If the test is complete before you realize it, then the feeling of being chosen may not be about destiny at all. It may be about recognition catching up to reality. The timing of this recognition is influenced by attention. During waking hours, attention is fragmented. Sensory input competes aggressively for cognitive resources. At night, especially during the circadian low point around 300 to 400 a.m., external competition diminishes. The brain turns inward, internal models update. Signals that were previously drowned out become audible. This is not mysticism, it is signal-to-noise ratio. When noise decreases, weak signals become detectable. This applies to telescopes, particle detectors, and human awareness alike. The universe does not become louder at night. We simply stop shouting over it. Historically, many scientists worked through the night not because they romanticized solitude, but because uninterrupted attention allowed subtle inconsistencies to surface. Einstein described moments of insight that arrived only after long periods of quiet reflection. These were not flashes of inspiration. They were delayed recognitions. The brain, like any complex system, processes information continuously even without conscious oversight. When enough evidence accumulates, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Consciousness receives it as a sudden realization, but the work was done long before. This delayed awareness is why transitions feel external, even when they are internal. The system changes. Awareness lags. The signal arrives. It feels like something has been given. In reality, something has been acknowledged. The language of crowns and elevation persists because humans are storytelling organisms. We frame transitions in narrative terms, but science strips away narrative and replaces it with mechanism. The crown, in this sense, is a new operating state, one that demands different inputs, tolerates different stresses, and fails under different conditions. In engineering, systems designed for higher performance operate closer to their limits. Safety margins shrink. Precision becomes essential. A bridge that carries more load has less tolerance for error. A high-energy reactor requires constant monitoring. Advancement always comes with fragility. This is why post-test phases often feel more demanding, not less. The system is now operating at a higher level of complexity. Feedback loops are faster. Consequences propagate more quickly. What once took months to unravel now collapses in days. People misinterpret this as punishment or cosmic irony. In reality, it is structural necessity. Higher-order systems are less forgiving because they have more to lose. The idea of heaven preparing something can be translated scientifically as environmental reconfiguration. When a system changes, the surrounding systems must adapt. This adaptation is not gentle. It involves stress redistribution, relationships shift, expectations realign. Old patterns that were compatible with the previous state become destabilizing. In ecological terms, when a keystone species changes behavior or population size, the entire ecosystem responds. Some species thrive, others disappear. The change is not moral, it is relational. At the cognitive level, this looks like reassessment of priorities. Values that once guided behavior lose relevance. New constraints demand new strategies. The mind resists this because it prefers continuity. But continuity is a luxury of stable systems, not transitioning ones. The urgency associated with final signals arises because time behaves differently near thresholds. In nonlinear systems, small delays can produce disproportionate outcomes. Missed adjustments compound rapidly. The system either stabilizes at its new level or collapses into chaos. This is why periods following major life changes are statistically associated with increased risk-taking error and burnout. The old rules no longer apply, but the new rules have not yet been learned. The system is exposed. In physics, this is the quench phase. A material is rapidly cooled or heated, forcing it into a new state. Defects form if the transition is not managed carefully. The material may appear solid, but microscopic stresses weaken it. Humans experience analogous defects, habits misaligned with new demands, coping mechanisms tuned for old pressures, beliefs that no longer fit. These are not failures. They are artifacts of transition. The silence that follows the test is often misinterpreted as abandonment. In reality, it is the absence of guidance, because guidance is no longer necessary. The system must self-regulate at its new level. External scaffolding is removed. In developmental psychology, this mirrors the shift from external regulation to internal regulation. Children rely on constant feedback. Adults are expected to self-correct. The transition is uncomfortable precisely because it transfers responsibility inward. This is where many narratives break down. They promise relief where there is only responsibility. They frame completion as rest when it is actually recalibration. From a cosmic perspective, the universe does not reward persistence. It responds to compatibility. Systems that match their environment persist. Those that do not are reconfigured or eliminated. There is no judgment, only interaction. Understanding this reframes the idea of being chosen. Selection is not favoritism. It is fit. It is resonance with conditions that happen to exist at a given moment. Change the conditions and the selection changes. This is why humility is built into scientific thinking. Every theory is provisional. Every model is subject to revision. Survival today does not guarantee relevance tomorrow. Stability is temporary. The danger of interpreting transitions as personal validation is complacency. Believing the crown is permanent leads to neglect. In physics, systems that stop adapting decay. Entropy increases. Order requires work. The test being complete means the work changes form, not that it ends. As we move forward, the focus shifts from endurance under uncertainty to maintenance under clarity. This requires different skills. Less tolerance for ambiguity, more precision, more accountability. The universe, having resolved one question, presents another.